Gaming is undeniably an unforgiving medium at times, where developers and publishers can spend years working on a game only for it to flop at launch. These video games all failed to sell as their publishers hoped on release. And sure, there may have been a number of different ways in which they were imperfect, but there's one particular overpowering factor which kept every single one of these games from enjoying commercial success. I'm Jess from WhatCulture, and here are 10 video game bombs that made one fatal mistake. Number 10. Not releasing free-to-play. Crash Team Rumble. Granted, you can argue that Crash Team Rumble's mere existence is a big mistake, given that Crash Bandicoot 4 developer Toys for Bob were forced to make the multiplayer party game instead of the fifth Crash game fans actually wanted. All the same, on paper, this actually wasn't a terrible idea given the popularity of Crash Bash, the 2000 game that came out which was pretty much Mario Party but Crash themed. But Activision made one major miscalculation which demonstrated a fatal misunderstanding of the current gaming market. Crash Team Rumble launched for a retail price of £25 or $30, and while that certainly can't be dubbed a rip-off price point, many fans nevertheless felt it should have been a free-to-play game given the scant amount of content and relatively repetitive gameplay loop. In an era where free-to-play games are commonplace and typically funded with varying degrees of success by battle passes and cosmetic microtransactions, Crash Team Rumble seems like an optimistic relic, no matter that the core gameplay is completely fine, if certainly not remarkable. Now, it's likely the game wasn't exactly going to be a smash hit if it launched free-to-play, but at least it would have given it a shot and not been beaten by a 2-year-old Peppa Pig game at launch, a thing that actually happened. Number 9. Marketing itself as another bland war shooter. Spec Ops: The Line. The marketing for third-person shooter Spec Ops: The Line seemed hell-bent on selling it as the most generic war-themed cover shooter imaginable. But that approach apparently proved too dully cynical even for Call of Duty fans, who largely ignored this game when it launched in June of 2012. Once reviews were out in the wild, though, it became clear that Spec Ops wasn't just another chest-beating slice of military fetishism, but a more cerebral, thoughtful, and disturbing thriller about the psychological toll of war. The trailers, though, did absolutely nothing to highlight this, basically focusing on adrenalized set pieces and nothing else. And while that was probably their tactic so they could have their big reveal of this being more than a generic shooter, it didn't do them any favors. And so, in a genre already wildly oversaturated by empty spectacles, Spec Ops posted disappointingly in its sales, in turn contributing to Take-Two's underwhelming financials in 2013. Time has been kind to the game, which endures as a bona fide cult classic today, no matter that it was recently delisted from all online storefronts due to the expiring license agreements. Number 8. The Toys to Life business model. Starlink Battle for Atlas. At a cursory glance, 2018's action-adventure game Starlink Battle for Atlas seemingly indicated yet another publisher attempting to hitch themselves to the Toys to Life gravy train, with players able to attach toy ships, pilots, and weapons to their controller in order to instantly load them into the game. Yet by 2018, the whole Toys to Life thing wasn't really a thing anymore, so before it even released, Starlink felt dated and kind of desperate in the format. More to the point, Ubisoft didn't do a great job of clarifying that Starlink's Toys to Life elements were entirely optional, with many surely taking a single look at the plastic-strewn marketing and dismissing it as yet another clutterfest money sink. Starlink could have been a modest success if it simply focused on filling the void left by the largely dormant Star Fox franchise, but more on that later. Yet by encumbering itself with a risky, costly gimmick, it basically sealed its own fate. Surprising few, this one underwhelmed Ubisoft commercially, and so they stopped producing toys for it when it was barely 6 months into its existence. Number 7. Not releasing on PS2 and Xbox Shenmu. There's no denying that the original Shenmue was a massive financial gamble, given it was not only the most expensive game ever produced at that time, with an estimated budget of up to $70 million, but also released exclusively on Sega's Dreamcast. Yet considering the relatively small owner base of the Dreamcast, in order to break even, they would have had to sell to every single console owner twice, which is not a thing that happened. So that ended up making it painfully clear that Sega should have also ported the game to the PS2 and Xbox in short order. Their failure to do this had wider ramifications for the series, as though Shenmue 2 was released on the Xbox, players' inability to easily play the first game beforehand set it up to flop, which it did. And of course, things could have been so different for Sega if they just opted for a multi-platform strategy for the first game. Ultimately, it would end up being almost 20 years before the original game was released on PlayStation and Xbox consoles, by which point the ship had long since sailed and sunk. Number 6. Trying to please everyone and pleasing no one. Saints Row 2022. Marketing 101 dictates that above all else, you need to make sure your audience understands what your product is. That is not what happened for 2022's Saints Row by Volition. Sure, we all knew it was the latest entry into the developer's hit sandbox action franchise, but the marketing failed to clarify precisely who it was made for. Trailers and previews painted a wildly mixed picture of what Saints Row was trying to be, at once tidying up the series' edgier past and trying to make the central characters more likable, while still retaining some of the IP's signature silliness. And yet, the result was a game that tried too hard to appeal to everybody and ended up appealing to pretty much nobody. Newcomers felt like they were being cynically pandered to, while core fans of the series felt that its identity had shifted too far away from that of the more unhinged earlier games. Even the fact that the gameplay is grossly unpolished couldn't have entirely doomed it if it had the charm and personality of the previous games. But instead, it felt like a lamely corporate waxwork impersonation of the series that never once passed the sniff test, and so flopped epically. Number 5. Being too short for the price. The Order 1886. To be clear, games should be as long or as short as feels organic for the developers, but the price should also reflect that, as was the neon sign-posted undoing of the PS4 exclusive third-person actioner, The Order 1886. Though the marketing did a great job of showing off the incredible steampunk London setting of this one, fans were a little concerned about the game's length in comparison to its full-fat AAA asking price. Mere days before launch, developer Ready at Dawn estimated that first-time players would take 8 to 10 hours to beat the game. And given that dev maths is definitely a thing, it's reasonable to knock off a few hours of that ballpark figure. And indeed, once the order hit stores, players soon enough found themselves clearing it in less than 6 hours, even without making an especially hurried rush through the story. Given that the game had little replay value, no multiplayer, and roughly half the playtime was comprised of cutscenes, many felt it simply wasn't worth the price Sony was asking for. Just a month after its release, Sony decided to slash the price by 1/3. Though it seems like what they probably should have done was beef up the experience from the get-go or cut the price from the get-go. While we shouldn't undersell the enormous effort that goes into making any game, for a $60 price tag, it was reasonable to expect more. And though artificial bloat is a bane of the industry, the Order's compelling world building surely lent itself to a much larger canvas and more substantial campaign. Number 4. Releasing during a crowded month. Titanfall 2. Now, EA only had themselves to blame when Titanfall 2 underperformed in 2016 because they released it at the world's worst time, and it certainly wasn't due to the game's quality, which was right up there. Respawn Entertainment's deliriously entertaining FPS sequel touted killer multiplayer and one of the genre's most memorable single-player campaigns of the last decade. So what went wrong? It's almost embarrassingly simple, really. EA rather overconfidently released the game in late October, a mere week after Battlefield 1 hit stores and a week before Call of Duty Infinite Warfare came out. By sandwiching this decidedly more niche FPS franchise, the first iteration of which crucially never released on PS4, between the two most popular FPS brands of the era, it was always going to be playing second or third fiddle. And so, despite its rave reviews, Titanfall 2 only sold 25% of what the first game sold, even though it came out on PS4 and the first game didn't. This could have been so easily avoided had EA simply nudged the game's release date back a few months. Instead, EA failed to let a potential future cash cow grow, ensuring Titanfall has been left on ice ever since. There is a small sliver of hope for Titanfall 3 though, given that the second game saw a resurgence in popularity when it finally came to Steam in 2020, with thousands of players still playing online daily. Number 3. Oversaturating the market. Guitar Hero Live. Once upon a time, the Guitar Hero franchise seemed almost bulletproof, with Guitar Hero 3 being the first game ever to hit $1 billion sold at retail. But in the years that followed, publisher Activision received vocal criticism for oversaturating the market with an increasing number of Guitar Hero titles, including band-centric spin-offs, yet doing little to sufficiently evolve the experience. After the sixth main game, Guitar Hero Warriors of Rock, underperformed in 2010, Activision put the franchise on hiatus until 2015, when they returned with reboot Guitar Hero Live. While the nifty new guitar and GHTV music video mode were praised, it simply wasn't enough to move the needle with the many millions who'd grown tired of the series, and so the game posted disappointing sales. Guitar Hero was an undeniable cultural touchstone for many of us between the mid-2000s to late 2000s, but by releasing a bunch of pretty mediocre games one after the other, they really did send it out to die, and so we tuned out permanently. I'm sorry. Number 2, going AAA instead of AA, Immortals of Aveum. By most accounts, Ascendant Studios' recently released Magic-themed FPS, Immortals of Aveum, is a decent enough game, if not one many rushed out to purchase. With mostly positive user reviews on Steam and a nice 69 Metascore, it seems to be an acceptably mid-tier offering, which, if budgeted responsibly, could have done just fine commercially. Yet the game was a bigger dice roll for Ascendant than it seems, since it actually cost an eye-watering $125 million to get this thing out. That's a price tag similar to those of more recognizable titles like Destiny and Shadow of the Tomb Raider, and clearly far too high a cost for what the game actually is. Though Immortals of Aveum's title, premise, and gameplay all felt categorically AA, the impressive visual fidelity was certainly AAA caliber, suggesting that Ascendant mistook the broader appeal of what they were making. Few were coming to a game like this for the pristine world-class graphics, and so with a more modest presentation, a VM could have cost drastically less and consequently launch for a AA price tag instead. Reining in the PC system requirements would have also made the game more accessible to a wider swath of players, given that many customers found themselves struggling to run the demanding title on even capable rigs. Ascendant CEO Brett Robbins himself even admitted that Immortals of Aveum would have performed better at a lower price point. In an era where a bunch of game budgets seem to be spiraling out of control, there's definitely a lesson to be learned here about the game's scope having gotten out of control and resulting costs. Number 1, the awful control scheme, Star Fox Zero. Even accepting the major commercial disadvantage that Star Fox Zero had by releasing on the doomed Wii U, it should have been a solid seller relatively speaking, especially as it was the beloved series' first mainline entry in an entire decade. But immediately upon launch, the Discord was flooded with one thing and one thing only: those gosh darn controls. The game's obtuse, arcane control scheme, complete with mandatory motion controls, felt unnatural from the jump and never seemed to grow on the player base at large. Critics and players alike were highly critical of them, which many felt ruined the entire experience and surely did its sales performance no favors at all. Ultimately, the game became the worst-selling Star Fox game in Japan and ended up shifting less than 500,000 copies globally. Considering that even Splatoon, an entirely new Nintendo IP, managed to sell almost 5 million units on the Wii U, that's an utterly shambolic showing. And while Star Fox Zero wasn't exactly a great game even if you could get past the controls, this was absolutely the reason that so many bounced off it so quickly, if they even bothered to try it at all.